Today we're going to talk about NGRX and how to manage our Angular state. So basically, you've got this diagram that is on the NGRX documentation website, but this is kind of the flow of NGRX. You've got the store, you've got actions, reducers, selectors, and effects. And today we're going to talk about how this works and how it all comes together in your components and using your services and how to very basically set up NGRX in your app. So the main thing we're going to talk about is a little bit about component store. If you don't need global state management, that's a nice nifty package that NGRX has created. But also we're going to talk about the store and effects packages as well, and what they add and what you can benefit from them. So the component store is basically a standalone library for managing local and or component state. You can use it for global, but it's highly recommended not to, if you're going to do global state, to use the global store. But basically the component store, if you're familiar with service with a subject, it's a little bit more polished. It's more robust. It's a nice to have. It's definitely better than just making your own stuff. It manages local state, and it has some really cool helper functions that we're going to get into. Initialization, you can definitely do it with eager loading or lazy loading. Eager loading, you basically just do it in the constructor. Lazy loading, you call the set state function that's built in with the component store to lazily load it later. Caveat is there are some functions that you can't use until the state is loaded, so you want to be careful with lazy loading in that regard. So when you're reading, there's this concept of a selector, which we'll get into more on the global state, but it's there's a helper function called select, so that you can select pieces of state. And so what this is going to do is the helper function returns an observable that you can async pipe in your component and get the latest version of what's in the state anytime it updates. So it allows the end user really to get the latest value without having to do any subscriptions in the component and things like that. So it's a really helpful way to get the state from your component store. The write. So there's three different ways to write to the state. One of them is using the updater. This is the one that I typically will use, most commonly will use this one in set state, but there's set state, patch state, and updater. The updater, I think one of the nuance differences is it lets you update a piece of state more easily rather than having to pass the whole state just to change it. But more on that with so patch state. The main thing here is it requires the state to be initialized in order for you to patch it. That's one caveat with this one. Updater, I don't believe it requires that. And then there is the set state, where basically you can set the entire state. And it's these three different ways to do it. Most common that I've seen is using the updater, set state, and then patch state I've seen less often. But there are just three different ways to update the state. I definitely recommend jumping into the documentation to dive into what works best for you. But again, typically the updater is what I've seen. Effects. So the concept of effects in the component store is kind of similar to what we're going to get into with the NGRX global store. The effects, they kind of isolate the side effects. So like calling an API or some kind of service, whether it's asynchronous or synchronous, it lets you do something and then return the action or the result of that action at the end of it. So with the component store, it's a nice little nifty method, helper method called effect, that basically generates an effect that allows you to do that. And you can pass it an empty observable or a void observable of type void, or whatever your input is. It'll take so like in this example on the screen, it'll take an observable string or just a string whenever you call the get movie function that's generated here. And it will go and do the switch map, go and call the API underneath the hood of the movie service. And then when it returns, if there's an error, it'll log the error, and then catch error will return an empty observable inside of that switch map so that you can then call get movie again later. But if there is no error, it'll add the movie using the add movie action that was created by an updater function earlier. So yeah, that's effects. So I made this presentation to be able to allow for some questions. So I'm curious what your questions might be. If you want to leave those in the comments or message me. Let me know what questions you might have. But now we're going to talk about the store. The global store, or the store package, contains the global store, and right behind my little picture frame thing is the effects. So sorry for covering that up, but basically the store is what I would call like the engine, or the big piece of the puzzle. And so what basically happens is the store package contains the actions, the reducers, and the selectors, packages, or not packages, the classes that you need. Effects is a separate package that we'll get into after the store, and the store is also included inside the package, and that's where the state is stored. So we'll kind of jump into the this a little bit. The use of RxJS is heavy in this one, but it's very simple. You can make it as simple or as complex as you want. But the NGRX store kind of follows the Redux. It follows the Redux pattern. It's the Redux pattern for Angular, and kind of the meat and potatoes is the reducers. They're the things that take in the actions and convert the state or change the state based on that. So let's talk about actions first, because I think you need actions. The main concept starts with actions, in my opinion, because nothing will happen if you don't have any actions defined. So the actions, basically what they do is they are kind of the like language for updating state, for changing state, for kicking off effects, doing whatever. So common actions usually include CRUD, so like set, add, update, remove, and whatever. But another way to write actions is using behavioral language. So like if somebody's clicking an accept button, you can have a click accept action or something like that that is more specific to the action that the user is taking, thus making it more behavior driven. So let's kind of take a look at what an action looks like. So I've made a very basic sample application that I can link to the GitHub link in the description. But here's a simple example of the action that has no props. Basically, load posts. I'm using the posts API. It's kind of a placeholder API that anybody can access. And so basically, this load post action in our app will kick off basically the API call to load posts. And so this will kick off the API using an effect, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then also this will be picked up by the reducer to affect the state, to basically tell our state that, hey, we're going to be loading until the posts get loaded. So more on that later. So here's the action. There's actually two different ways to do the actions. There's actually more than two different ways, but these are the two more common ways I've seen it, unless you really like to type. The create action helper function is pretty nifty if you're just making little one-off actions, but I prefer the create action group if you're making multiple actions for a particular type of state. So for the posts, if you see the create action group, I've actually got the source set up as posts for one of them, and then one of them is posts API. So the posts API, the distinction there is that these are actions that are kicked off from the result of an API call to the posts. And the posts source is things that will either kick off the action or the effect, or they're just simple actions that don't call any APIs or things like that. So in this particular example, very simple. We've just got posts and post API where we're just going to load the posts. And then when the posts get loaded, we're going to then set the state in the reducer. And so what you've got here, so the other thing too is the create action group. If you notice the source posts, if you look at the create action at the top in the example, that's the same way. It's going to create a string that has that square braces for the source. And that's kind of the language of NGRX, or the Redux pattern, is having the source in square braces. And then the action name is after that, and it's using spaces. These helper functions generate types that have a camel case name based on the event name. And more on that later. You'll see that in the examples, but that's just a little caveat. Not really a caveat, just a little thing to know about it. So here we have the reducer. We're going to jump into the reducer right now. And so basically the reducer is what takes an action and converts or updates the state based on the action. So in the reducer, we're going to jump into that. So we have basically your state. You want to have an interface defined for your state, and then you want to have an initial state defined, and then you can use this create reducer helper function, and the first parameter is the initial state, and then every parameter after that is this on function helper. And so if you notice, the way it kind of reads is on the load posts action, and then you have a callback that takes the state, and then if there's any payload, it'll take that payload as the second parameter, but then it returns a new state object in that callback. So if you notice, we're doing on the load posts, we're taking the state, then we're doing the spread operator to get the current state, and then we're only updating the loading value to true. And so what's going on is we're doing the load posts call, and it's going to set loading to true. And now we've already defined the post loaded success. We haven't defined the action. You haven't seen that action defined, I don't think, yet. But what that's going to do is, or I think we did define it, but the post load success is going to take the posts from the API response, and then we're going to set the state to the posts that we get back, and then set loading to false. So let's go ahead and move forward to looking at the actions with the reducer again. So we've got that post load success. So we did define it, and now it's taking the props of a type post array. And so that is the input to that on function for the callback. So we've got state and the payload from the actions. So now that you've kind of seen the reducer, it's probably a good time to show you how to get this reducer set up. And that's in the app module for global state. So for this example, we're going to use global store, but you can also do feature modules, feature level stores. But we're just going to get into the global state for right now. And so you'll have the store module imported, and then do .forRoot. And then the first parameter is an object with the name of the feature, and then colon the reducer name that you're going to import from when you saw the reducer that we created. Now, the second parameter in forRoot is for meta reducers, which we're not going to cover, but there's ways to, whenever you're reducing stuff, to be able to do some other actions. But we're not going to get into that in this particular time. So now let's go on to the selectors. So now we've got actions, we've got reducers, and the store is registered. Now we want to see data. We want to see things change. So now we're going to talk about selectors. So the selectors, there's a helper function so that you create the feature selector to get, so like, notice that name posts, that's the same name as the name that we registered the reducer for. So the selector is going to get from the global state the posts section of that state, and then any other subsequent selector, it just is easier to grab the posts state and then use that to grab whatever piece of state off of the posts. So the create feature selector is used to grab the posts information, and then after that we create a regular selector using that first parameter is another selector that allows us to then grab the post state specifically, rather than having to do global state.posts.loading or global state.posts.posts. So this is allowing us to, again, select the state. So let's go ahead and see this in our component. So I made this really simple posts component, and here's the TypeScript for it. And we've gotten the ng on init. We're doing the store, the global store. We're going to dispatch the action of load posts. And what I've done here is I've set a timeout. Since we haven't set up anything to call the API, it's got a 3-second wait before it does the posts load success. So what we're going to do is we're going to go see the HTML as well to see how we wire this up. But if you notice in here, there's no subscribes. ng on init, this is just calling that load. So like when this component initializes, it's going to dispatch the load action, and then 3 seconds later, it's going to dispatch the post load success with a test post. So in our HTML, very simple, we've got ngIf on the loading with a pipe async. So what this does is it allows the template to handle the subscribing and unsubscribing, and that loading is set to, if you remember, that's set to the selector of the, actually I think I can go back, up at the top, I did forget to mention this, the loading is set to the select loading. So the loading selector and the posts selector is what the posts $ is set to. So now if we go down here, you'll see we're pipe async, and then we do an ng4 on that list to get the title and the body. So now if we go and watch, I have a animated thing here to kind of show that it's doing loading, and then the loading goes away and shows the post the test title and the test body. So after that, now we're going to talk about effects. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Definitely let me know. So the effects package, we're talking about this little piece that's right behind my head. Let's see if I can get rid of my little floating head for a second. Boop. There it is, the effects. So we're going to talk about the effects. And what these are things that allow us to call the API or do some other thing and then return some other action with the result of said thing. Typically, it's an API call or a call to a service or some kind of side effect that occurs. So here's how we define an effect. We create in this case, a post effects class, but we define an injectable class, kind of like a service, and the constructor takes the parameter of the actions, and then any service that you want to call, you also inject that here as well. And then we create this observable. It's sort of an observable, but it's going to be using the create effect helper function. And using that, it's got a callback that returns the actions.pipe. And then there's this helper operator called of type that lets you filter on types of actions. So this actions observable that we're piping into, any action that gets called that is registered with the reducers or with the store flow through here. And so the of type lets us filter on, we only want specific types of actions. And so this one, we get the load post action. So now whenever we do this exhaust map, it's going to take that action as the event that we're queuing off of. And there was no inputs, there's no props, so there's nothing to pass through to it. So we're just going to load the posts. And so the post service.getPost has an API call under the hood. We're going to call that. And then when we get the data back, we're going to map that to the post load success action with the posts as the payload. And so basically we're going to get actual data. And so the way that you register your effects is you go back to the app module. Again, we're doing global for this example. In the effects module, you'll import and then you'll do .forRoot and then array of whatever effects classes that you have created. And so in this case, the posts effects. And so once you register that, now we can go and we removed the set timeout call and it just does the dispatch load post action. And now we get actual data from the posts API. And we didn't have to go and do any other types of magic. It was just make this API call, map the posts into an action. So that's all wired up. You just go, you navigate, and it loads. And it does say loading still, but it's so fast. This is not an animation. It's just the result. Just imagine it saying loading, and then this stuff shows. So yeah, so now we're going to talk about how it all comes together. I know that I kind of talked about it individually and how it kind of comes together as we went. We're just going to kind of go through a little bit of a flow here. So all together now, we start out with the component, and it's going to do that ng on init. It's going to do the action of the load posts, and then it does go to the reducer to set loading, but it also is going to go over to the effects, which is going to make the API call, and then come back to the effects to then map to an action, the post load success. It's going to go into the reducer. It's going to modify the state to have the posts are now going to be set to the array that we got back from the service, and loading is going to be set to false, and the selector is going to be updated, and the component is going to get the latest version of the data. And that's how we walk through NGRX at a very high level. So with that, if there's any questions, please definitely comment. Let me know if there's anything that you would like to see, anything that I might have left out. But that's a high level overview of NGRX.